Legalism. Legalism is a funny thing. Legalism is spirit. And, interestingly, when people are caught up in legalism, it's always scriptures they are quoting. So there can be this, sense of fear, like, well, they quoted a verse, and how do I get around that verse? But legalism is spirit. So, people can use scriptures and quote scriptures to defend their position, but really what's the problem is that the spirit behind the scriptures is wrong. Therefore, the scriptures are wrong, or the way they're using them is wrong. So the devil, you have to remember, even in Matthew 4, the devil used the scriptures against Jesus. He was quoting the Bible, but the spirit of the devil is evil. And so the scriptures he was quoting weren't holy. They weren't being used right. They weren't being applied right. When Jesus came up against legalism, it's very interesting. He would undo the scriptures. And that's kind of what I want to share in this brief video. He would actually kind of untie them, and he would show people who are struggling with legalism that they're standing on shaky ground if they're just being legalistic about the written word, because Jesus is the living word. He says in John 6:63, my words are spirit and they are life. If that spirit and life of Christ is not behind the scriptures being used, then the scriptures aren't being used correctly. Interestingly, in Matthew 12, when the Pharisees were kind of bringing the scriptures or the law of the Sabbath against Jesus, in Matthew 12, 4 and 5, Jesus shows them the limitations of using the word for this kind of self-righteous, judgmental spirit. He actually references 1 Samuel 21, when David ate the bread that was consecrated, and Jesus went on to say it was unlawful for him to eat it. Listen, I've actually grown up in church circles. I've heard people preaching on why David, who was in the line of the priesthood, it was actually okay for him to eat the bread. People are trying to get around these things and make it as if he wasn't really breaking the law. But Jesus in Matthew 12:4 says he was breaking the law. He said it was unlawful, but it was okay. Then Jesus goes on in verse 5, Matthew 12:5, he says the priests desecrate the Sabbath because they do stuff that the law says don't do. They do it on the Sabbath in the temple, and he says, yet they're innocent. So Jesus kind of unties the fabric on which a lot of people who are caught in legalism stand on. The very scriptures they're quoting to judge themselves and judge others. Jesus shows that there can be consistencies even in the written word. Why? Because, as it were, there's a law higher than the law. God is spirit. The written code is to elevate the Spirit of God. Where the Spirit of God is, it's higher than the written law. And Jesus pointed that out about David eating the bread. That whole law wasn't really important in that instance. When the priests are desecrating the Sabbath, he says they're innocent. What they're doing is more important than those rules. And that can be the same, my friends, for you and me. As we walk with the Spirit, there can be times where the law of Christ and the law of his love is more important than a certain written rule and regulation. We have to accept that. It might not make us comfortable because we ate from the tree of knowledge. We're full of pride. We want to be able to notch our belts and prove why we're holy. So it can be uncomfortable when the law of the Spirit meets the written law and the law of the Spirit supersedes the written law. We just have to move in that freedom of Christ. There's so much on this, guys. In Galatians 5:2, Paul says, if you circumcise these people, Christ means nothing to you. But then in Acts 16:3, Paul circumcises Timothy. Is that a contradiction? No, it's where the Spirit was getting mixed up with the wrong spirit. And he's like, okay, if you do this, in this situation, it means this. But if I do this in this situation, the same thing, it means something completely different. Why? Because the Spirit is different. So I just share these things because that legalism thing can be very, it can just tie people up in knots and sink their ship. Jesus said in John 5:39-40, he said, you search the scriptures, he says to the Pharisees, who are tied up in legalism and Pharisaism. He says, you search the scriptures because in them you think you possess eternal life, but you refuse to come to me and have life. Another one that comes to mind is in John 10, and I'll leave it here. John 10, when Jesus claimed to be God, that's what they were saying. John 10:33, I and the Father are one. They're like, you, a mere man, claim to be God. They were correct. That's what he was claiming. And then as they go to stone him, he's very shrewd. He said, well, hold on. Your scriptures say that you are gods. And he's quoting Psalm 82:6. What does he mean by this? It's like he's playing with their heads. He's like, and the scriptures can't be set aside. Scriptures say you are gods. How much more when I say I am the Son of God? But it's funny that Jesus quotes the scriptures where it says something literal, you are gods. We know mortals aren't gods, but why was he quoting the scriptures to put it to them and then say the scriptures can't be denied? In a weird way, he was playing with their heads. He was revealing the limitations of their addiction to pride, legalism, and the written code instead of the living spiritual code. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Galatians 5:1. So just discern a spirit of legalism. If that's what's behind the preaching, if that's what's behind the teaching, if that's what's behind the leading, discern the spirit. It doesn't matter if they're using scriptures that seem to all go together like X plus Y equals Z. God isn't an equation. And we see contradictions, as it were, in the Bible that release the spirit of freedom. One last one. I said the last one was, but Rahab. In the Old Testament, Rahab hid the spies, which was already against the code of the land. Then she lied about it against the law of God. But we're told that she was righteous. In fact, she's upheld in Hebrews 11, the hall of faith, they call it, the chapter of faith. Rahab is referred to as like a champion of the faith. All we know about Rahab is that she was a prostitute. She broke the law of the land, hiding the spies. She broke the law of God, lying about the spies. And she's heralded as a champion of our faith in Hebrews 11. So we need to access that freedom of God, the law of the Spirit. Don't let legalism bind you. The freedom flows in the Word and through Christ.